Hi there. There have been many books written about the Falklands campaign, or as it's commonly called, the Falklands War, although it was never officially a war. The book we're going to discuss today, Exocet Falklands, by Ewen Southby Tailyour, concentrates on the special forces elements of the conflict, and it covers some of the most sensitive operations which we will discuss in this review. During the conflict, there was speculation about the role of special forces. The newspapers obviously convinced that we had guys rolling round the capital, creating havoc. But the government's view, or the government's position, has always been they don't comment on special forces. However, when it's in their interest, they do. And pretty soon after the start of the whole thing, when South Georgia was recaptured, the government did let it be known that the SAS were involved, because they really needed a tick in the wind column, really. So regarding the Special Forces commitment to the Falklands, the SAS had sent G Squadron and D Squadron plus two section of the SBS down there. G Squadron's role was manning OPs to ascertain the Argentinian troop positions and strengths, and provide the battle picture to higher command. While D Squadron had a variety of tasks, most notable being the raid on Pebble Island, where they destroyed 11 Pucara ground attack aircraft. They were more of an as-needed squadron, doing whatever came up in the course of the changing picture. And it had been them who had been involved in the South Georgia operation, although initially the weather was so terrible down there that they were unable to land. Remember, even though it was April and May here, that in the southern hemisphere, that is the winter. And it's one of the harshest places on the planet. There were rumours of mainland operations, particularly when a little bit later on there was a crashed Sea-King helicopter discovered in Chile. So those rumours did circulate for quite a while, and it was only after quite a few years when memoirs started to be written, and guys who had served in the SS, particularly in the squadrons involved, started mentioning what had happened. So there were three operations targeting the mainland: Operation Plum Duff, Operation Mikado, and Operation Kettledrum. And Kettledrum, as far as I know, had never been discussed before this book. It was very, very much a secret. Plum Duff was originally going to be two patrols taken from 6 Troop and 9 Troop, the boat troop and the mountain troop of B Squadron, each targeting an individual airbase down there, mainly to give early warning about the Super 8 on Dards movements, because they were the ones carrying the Exocets, which was such a hazard to the task force ships. It was the mission came right from DLB, Brigadier de la Billiere, at SAS Group Headquarters. And then it was the two patrols were amalgamated into one patrol, mainly 6 Troop guys with a couple from 9 Troop, and they were going against just a single target, and it was no longer just a reconnaissance task. It was also a sabotage task, so they had to take a lot of explosives with them, which meant they couldn't take as much food and clothing and so on, and this all had a knock-on effect. The patrol commander was the captain in charge of the boat troop, Captain Andy Legg. Now his surname isn't revealed in the book, but since publication he has come out and publicly spoken about his role and allowed himself to be identified. I won't reveal names that are not mentioned publicly. So he's given the job and he's briefed by DLB, and very, very quickly a couple of the senior NCOs, including the Squadron Sergeant Major, tell him that to really watch his back, that the mission seems very, very dodgy. So at this time there's no real insertion plan, whether they're going to parachute, whether they're going to go in by helicopter or submarine. No one knows. In the event, they go down to Ascension and then board a C-130 and parachute into the Atlantic. And the problem was the equipment containers they had not been properly waterproofed. Now, the SBS had suitable containers for doing this, for water jumps, but either nobody had thought to ask them or they weren't available. But in the event, they just tried to do their best with masking tape, which proved woefully ineffective. So they also jumped in wetsuits, which were not suitable. They should have had dry bags. And so they arrived, were picked up, taken to Hermes, and looked after very well by the Royal Navy, given hot drinks and warm clothing and so on. But their kit was still quite waterlogged. And then they met up with the crew of the Sea King that had been tasked to deliver them. It was the pilot was Richard Hutching, and the navigator was Wag Bennett. And so the problem, one of the many problems, was the mapping was pathetic. They were given one map was evidently taken out of a school book, and the other map was of a scale that was unusable for the job, and that was it. Intelligence on the location of the base, etc., defences, nil. It was so far from being the usual very, very well thought out, methodical 6 Ps SAS operation that it really was more of a cowboy show. The insertion and the helicopter crew did an amazing job. They had to avoid all sorts of hazards, including being illuminated by the enemy radars and so on. Managed to find their way to what they believed was the drop-off point. It turned out it wasn't, but that's life. However, even though it wasn't the nominated drop-off point, Captain Legg had seen lights and believed that they'd been compromised, and requested that they be moved to an alternative drop-off point. It was only discovered after the war, many years later, in Argentinian documents, that they had indeed been detected. They'd been picked up on radar, and had the patrol deployed, they would have been no doubt rounded up. So they dropped at another point inside Chile, and then the helicopter, the plan was for them to ditch distance away to so that they weren't compromising the patrol, and destroy the helicopter, the aircrew to go to ground for a period of days, so as to give the patrol time to do the job, and then the aircrew would surrender to local authorities. And that was their plan. Where the patrol had been dropped off was 80 miles from the target. They had 4 days of rations, their clothing was soaked, and nevertheless they started to move towards the target, moving mainly during the night. Navigation was a nightmare. There was no features. They couldn't coordinate where they were, but they kept going in the general direction that they needed to, despite having one of the guys go down with a fever. Conditions were terrible, and they realized that with the food they had, getting to the target, never mind getting back again, was going to be a monumental task. Now, it has been said by some accounts, by people writing about the operation, that once they were in Chile, they just gave up and took no further part. They didn't. They kept going towards the target. They had radio contact with Hereford, and after being told to continue the mission, they were finally told to make for an emergency RV where one of a reception committee, Captain Pete Hogg, would be there to meet them and would be able to brief them on what to do next. So Andy Legg left 6 of the guys near to the RV, which was a bridge, while him and another guy made for a nearby small town or village in order to get food and warm clothing to bring back for everyone. While they were there, and they made the way to this village, and they were looked after very, very well by the locals. They were given some food and so on, and things were looking good. But they happened to look into a cafe in the village, and to their amazement, there was Pete Hogg, together with Bronco Lane and Brummy Stokes, 2 very well-known regiment guys, and they were all sitting there, obviously with no intention of making the RV at the bridge. And this meeting led to the eventual extraction of the team back through the embassy in Santiago, and that was it as far as Plum Duff was concerned. The air crew did what they were supposed to do, and they were eventually also repatriated. Okay. The book does go into amazing detail on the operation, so I'm going to leave it at that as regards Plum Duff. I'll just go on to the second mission, Operation Mikado. It was a totally different type of operation. It was more of an Entebbe style assault. The idea was to land 2 Hercules on the target air base and debus the squadron, who had a total of 4 Pink Panthers and motorcycles. They would then attack and destroy the Super 8-on-Dart aircraft, and also attack the aircrew and kill them. And then the Hercules could either try and take off and make it over the border to Chile, or probably would be damaged by ground fire. The crew would have to E&E. Meanwhile, the regiment guys would also E&E on foot, and probably not together with the air crew, by the way. That was the plan. This, again, all came from the Duke of York's, from DLB. So B Squadron were given this task, they started working with the RAF on it. Now the book goes into an exercise which had been conducted just a couple of months or weeks earlier, in March of '82, by the RAF Special Forces flight against an RAF base in Germany, RAF Larbruch. And the idea was to land a Hercules with SAS aboard and carry out sabotage. The main objective was to see if they could penetrate. Anyway, they do all the low-level flying, etc., get onto the ground, they debust the squadron guys, and then it's called Index, and there's a debrief. In the debrief, they found out that they had been illuminated, they'd been picked up, and had it been for real, they would have been blown out of the sky. They did a subsequent exercise against a Scottish airbase with very similar results. Now, the important thing to note is these are well-known air bases. The pilots are familiar with them. The details are well available. The patterns, the runway angles and so on. The type of defences are well known. They're British equipment, so they all know the frequencies and so on. The airfield was illuminated at night. It was a working airfield, so they were not operating in wartime conditions, and yet they couldn't penetrate. So, excuse me, the RAF knew this, and had they been asked their opinion, they would have been able to give the reasons why it wasn't possible. The book also does go into a lot of detail about the Special Forces flight, who are the successors to the wartime special duties flights, who carried SOE and SIS personnel into occupied Europe. And the crews of the SF flight were given special training in survival, escape and evasion, resistance to interrogation, and so on. However, the aircraft were not, they didn't have their own dedicated aircraft. They were just allotted aircraft as a task requirement. And they continually asked for modifications to be made or equipment to be installed in vain. The people running the RAF were usually fast jet pilots, and they didn't really pay attention to the needs of the Hercules people. So later on, of course, using the example of the United States Air Force with their special operations capability, things did change. But at the time of the Falklands, it was still, as I've just mentioned. So as the briefing from Mikado progresses and DLB turns up in Hereford to see how everything's going, the Staff Sergeant of 6th Troop, Jakey Vaughan, has given serious misgivings to his squadron commander, John Moss, and asks to be relieved. He doesn't want any part in this Mikado. Now, historically within the SAS, the old and the bold, the senior NCOs have been listened to. They are the backbone, and they are the voice of it. They're the continuity and the voice of experience of what can be done and what can't be done. And their opinion is usually sought and usually listened to. John Moss had his own reservations, apparently, and when DLB turned up at Brad Lines, he was told that there was a certain amount of disquiet, and he reacts by sacking John Moss and gives the job to Ian Crook, who is the 2IC of the regiment at the time. Ian Crook then takes over B Squadron and faces the job of motivating the guys and getting on with it. So they go down to Ascension, and they do a certain amount of training and practice down there while waiting for the go order. While this is going on, the number of exocets that the Argentines have is reduced to 1. The British knew how many they started with. The French had told them they had 5. They'd fired 4, so there was 1 left. And in the event that 1 was fired at the task force and was either hit by defensive fire or exploded of its own accord, nobody really knows, but it didn't hit anything. But Mercado would have tried to take out this 1 remaining Exocet, and you have to say, would it be worth 2 Hercules on a squadron of SAS being sacrificed for that, which in the event it never hit anything? That's a thing to consider. Obviously, and this was known, they know the numbers, but then Mercado was scrubbed. Now, there's a lot of misinformation being purveyed by people who were in on the operation. One former member of B Squadron who was on the op said that they were aboard the Hercules with their vehicles, with the engines turning, when a message was handed that the op was scrubbed and they all debussed for tea and biscuits. That was not true. It could not be true, as the author of the book points out, because the Hercules aircraft that were being used in the Falklands, and they were being used for resupply of the task force on numerous times. The aircrew were flying tremendous hours all the time. They had to do air-to-air refueling, which is very strenuous. But they also carried additional internal tanks in the cargo bay. And in order to load the vehicles, these tanks would have had to have been removed. And that would have been the plan. Had the mission gone ahead, they'd have taken the tanks out to give room to the vehicles. That was not done. So there's no way that the squadron was sitting on the tarmac with 2 Herkies full of vehicles ready to go. That just couldn't have happened. And it's strange that stuff like that has been put out there in the literature of the campaign. Now, as I say, the planning of this was really down to DLB, but the author points out that there was no way that this op would have ever been allowed. The higher command of the Ministry of Defence, both military and civilian, were totally against the mainland option, and it would not have happened. They did allow it to be planned and prepared, but that was it. But politically, it was a no-go. And the author does point out that there were 3 options considered. Firstly, would have been air attacks by probably the Vulcans. They did the Black Book raids against Port Stanley airfield very successfully. They could have attacked the mainland airfields with precision, taking out the runways and with little collateral damage. That was politically not an option. Mercado was politically not an option. And the third option, which is just hypothetical by the author, would have been for SIS to introduce agents into the area, possibly a man posing as a man and wife, with suitable local cover, to just observe aircraft departures and have a communication set up to pass the message back. That didn't happen, and it wasn't even considered. Then the third secret operation against the mainland was Operation Kettledrum, and as I said, this book was, in my experience, it was the first book to reveal it, and it was conducted by the SBS by using HMS Onyx, a submarine, and it was so critical that the commanding officer himself led it, because he thought it was a one-way trip and he didn't want his guys to do anything he wasn't prepared to do himself. In the event, this too was scrubbed. But they did have the rehearsals and so on for it. So that's it really. The mainland operations, very interesting and very much a mythical part of the history until the truth's known. Plum Duff, the guys who conducted, as I say, they were from the boat troop and the mountain troop, who were used to arduous conditions, and they couldn't make it happen. Captain Legg, he felt the responsibility and decided to leave the regiment and the army after the Falklands. And lots of fingers were pointed, but I think the book does exonerate him and his guys to a large extent. Mikado, what can you say about that? It was really, it was almost a fantasy operation, an Entebbe Thunderbolt type raid dreamed up by DLB. The SAS usually conduct a very thorough cross brief at the end. After the Falklands, they didn't, so the sores tended to fester and have really provoked some lasting negativity, which comes out in books every now and again with people poking fingers at each other. This book, well worth reading. It's so detailed. By the author who was down there. He was the advisor on landing craft for the Royal Navy. He had done extensive boating around the Falklands, so he knew the area, and his advice was taken on board by the Navy. But he's not just relying on his own experience. He interviewed lots of people. He used archives from both the UK and the Argentine side, as well as a lot of the published memoirs. Terrific book, very, very detailed, and it is really eye-opening in many, many areas.